Today, I want to discuss a tweet that I have seen pop up on Reddit, Discord and Twitter a number of times regarding how Germany might win World War II. I thought it might be fun to respond to the points made in the tweet, whether they'd actually be solid military strategies for the Germans to employ and whether they'd actually be realistically tried. This is the tweet in question, with 6 points which should lead to Germany winning the war. Also, I hope that I don't need to tell you, but this is just for fun. Don't harass the creator of this post. This is just meant as a light-hearted and informative response to the points that they made. This video will also be divided into 2 parts. First, I will explain the points individually and the issues that they might have, before then diving into what a full scenario might look like if all of these points were attempted by Germany. Let's dive in. So the first point is don't terror bomb Britain, but focus on Royal Air Force facility. This is an absolute classic, a change often brought up to boost German odds, and it's quite a logical one. The usual story is that Germany was bombing airfields, anti-air and other military installations on Britain, almost completely destroying the British Air Force. In a desperate move, Churchill ordered a bombing run on Berlin, and Hitler was so angered that he demanded the Luftwaffe to start focusing on terror bombing London and other British cities instead, which allowed the British Air Force to recover and win the conflict. Now the issue with this is that it way oversells German effectiveness while underselling their losses. During the most intense months of the Battle of Britain, Germany lost 15% of their aircraft twice. This is a huge blow to the German Air Force. Even worse is the loss in pilots. Any German plane getting shot down over Britain is irreversibly lost, with the pilots captured by the British. Again, in 2 months' time, Germany's air-ready crew decreased by an average of about 20%. The shift towards broader targets like London was not just an emotional one. It was also one to preserve the German Air Force, as these losses for months on end are unsustainable. But were the Germans at least successful in defeating the British Air Force itself? Also, not really. Across these 2 months of heavy German losses, Britain's operational fighter count remained roughly similar. The reason for this was simple. Britain was producing enough, Germany was not destroying enough, and British planes and pilots could much more easily be saved and potentially sent back to fight another day. None of these factors would radically change if Germany continued to focus on Royal Air Force targets. Fact is, rough runways are quite cheap, and Germany was just taking too many losses to continually damage the radar installations, aircrafts, airfields and factories making planes to really make the difference and destroy the British Air Force in a meaningful way. Besides, Churchill had, by this point, solidly convinced Britain to continue the fight. Even if, by some miracle, the Royal Air Force would be completely wiped out, Britain had 1.5 million soldiers called up to defend against invasion, and still commanded arguably the largest navy in the world. And besides, if Germany does eventually shift to other targets following the destruction of the Air Force, Britain will swiftly be able to whip up a new Air Force in the downtime. All in all, this first point isn't too bad, but it really isn't enough to force Britain to surrender, and it is likely too little to fundamentally cripple their Air Force permanently. Moving on though, we reach a much more interesting point. Demand Mussolini not be an idiot with Balkans. This is a pretty funny one, as it can mean 2 things. First, it might just mean demand that they do better and actually defeat Greece, meaning Germany wouldn't have to intervene in the region. Now I hope that I don't need to tell you, but Italy did do their best, and simply demanding them to do better isn't going to change the fundamentals of the military situation. Now the alternative meaning is funnier, as it could mean that Germany demands that Mussolini doesn't even try the invasion at all. Where this suggestion goes wrong is that it paints the picture of Italy as a mere German puppet. While this is pretty accurate for the latter half of World War II, by 1940 it was very much untrue. Italy too was an aggressive, proud, nationalistic dictatorship. They were, frankly, shocked by Germany's military victory, and the invasion of Greece was step 1 in Italy expanding their own influence. ensuring that they aren't completely overshadowed by the Germans. So, such a demand by Germany would basically amount to, do as we say, and maybe we will allow you some minor expansion after the war. For 1940 Italy, this simply wouldn't do, especially as Germany was already refusing expansion into France and Tunis. And Germany also refused to give up on their claims on northern Italy. Should Mussolini really accept this demand, he is basically surrendering Italy's status as a European great power. Beyond that, it is unlikely that this would actually make a difference. Some have argued that the Balkan campaign delayed Operation Barbarossa, taking away crucial weeks that the Germans could have used to capture Moscow and win the war. This theory, though, was spread by the German dictator and his military leadership, who always had the same answer to every military mistake: wasn't me. Today's historians generally agree that the Balkan campaign did little to influence Operation Barbarossa. The Russian winter of 1940 had been wetter than usual, causing bad conditions for fast tank maneuvers. Beyond that, German logistics simply weren't prepared for the invasion yet. With or without the Balkan campaign, Barbarossa would be delayed by around the same time. And, at least in our timeline, the Balkan was fully secured, meaning no sudden surprises there later in the war. Alright, so the second point is a bit of a dud, but let's see the third. Don't siege Leningrad, take it immediately? This is a very puzzling one. Do they think the siege of Leningrad happened because Germany wanted to grind army XP? No, they did it because they had no choice. Germany didn't have the tank forces needed to swiftly take the city, and correctly realized that an attempted invasion of a city of hundreds of thousands would be a military disaster. Of course, it is possible to redirect panzers to the north, but they'd have to be pulled from the far more important fronts, while still requiring an absolutely hellish fight for the city. And if you redirect forces later, defenses would have already been set up and the city would have become even more difficult to take. Point is, Leningrad, quite simply, wasn't too big of a priority to Germany. Yes, it would be a relief and it would open up forces for deployment elsewhere, but the fall of the city couldn't compare to the potential war-winning implications of capturing Moscow or Stalingrad. It was just quite simply the least important of the three major cities. A capital in ruin, starving itself to death, posing no immediate military threat to Germany. Of course, capturing it would have been better, but just take Leningrad isn't really that simple of an option. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. Keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. We then reach the fourth point. Zurich rushed Stalingrad to cut off Soviet oil. This is a fascinating one because that's exactly what the Germans did. They tried that. It led to the disaster of Stalingrad. The Germans were very aware that this should be a major objective. Problem was, they couldn't make it happen. The Soviets were still way stronger than the Germans expected, and German logistics were being tested to their absolute limits. Now, an alternate reading of this point is that it should have been a larger objective in the initial invasion. This too would be very risky, as the other pushes would have to be reduced, while the infrastructure in the south is stretched way too thin. The push in the south would get further, but at the cost of not even coming close to Moscow nor Leningrad, which makes just taking it even more difficult. Soviet losses would be lessened too, while a counteroffensive could swiftly risk German supply and their entire offensive. Moving on, we have the fifth point, which is ally with the Slavs against the commies. This is mostly in reference to the collaborationists in Ukraine, as it has often been suggested that creating an autonomous Ukrainian and perhaps Belarusian state would have been much better for Germany than direct military occupation, treating them as a subjugated people and starting their horrific plans for the region. Now, of course, the issue here is the German high command. They expected a swift victory, 2 years at the maximum. What is the point in allying with a people that you plan to destroy the minute the war is over? By the time the Germans might realize the benefit of an alliance with Ukraine, it would likely already be too late, as Germany would have already lost much of the goodwill of the population, and the Soviets and allies would already be on the move. Still, this is perhaps the best point out of the 6. If the Germans do indeed swallow their pride earlier, there will be plenty to be found which might want to fight the communists, as the Bolsheviks had been far from kind to the Ukrainians. The Germans might be able to recruit more from the population there, while they would have an easier time in terms of logistics in the south. Though this would mostly be a supporting factor, and it is unlikely that this would be enough to make something like the Caucasus operation a success. With that, we reach the final point on the list: ignore Africa. Now this is perhaps the most baffling point. First, I had previously assumed that the author, wrongly, might have assumed that airstrikes would be enough to make Britain surrender. But if that's true, then how is there still an African front to be fought? So, assuming that Britain is still in the war, let's run through why ignoring Africa is a horrible thing for Germany to do. By early 1941, the British had practically overrun East Africa and had captured eastern Libya too. It seemed like soon the Italians might be completely thrown from the continent. Of course, Italy would reinforce their own positions in Libya, but they also requested German aid. So Germany would send a relatively minor Africa Corps to reinforce the Italian. Of course, this directed minor resources from the Eastern Front, but really not a game-changing amount. Meanwhile, despite only being commanded to defend the Libyan positions, Rommel would manage to completely turn the tides of the war. Mainly due to his Africa Corps, the capture of Africa was delayed by at least a year. Now let's imagine that Germany didn't do this. Libya wouldn't necessarily immediately fall, but Italian counteroffensives are unlikely to. Meanwhile, it sends yet another quite clear signal to Italy. We don't care about your conflict, we don't care about your ambitions on France, and we will not allow your expansion in the Balkans. Now, it may just be me, but I don't see any reason for Italy to even be allied to Germany by this point. So, this could quickly become a military and political disaster, as once Italy is evicted from Libya, the rest of North Africa swiftly follows. By now, we could see the Allies plan a naval invasion of Italy a year earlier, and Italy will have absolutely no reason to continue their participation in the conflict. Much earlier, Germany's military situation becomes a lot more complicated, especially as the author hasn't mentioned anything about America, leaving them very open to intervene in the conflict, as the Allies might even manage to spin the unconquered Balkans in their favor. So, with all of these points discussed, let's see a single timeline where Germany implements all of these concepts. Nothing will have changed until the fall of France, when the Germans begin to focus on trying to destroy the British Air Force. After the first 2 months of the operation, Germany is suffering unsustainable losses, while the British fighter count is remaining rather stable. But rather than scale down operations, attacking relatively easier targets like mass bombing London, the Germans staunchly continue with their current strategy. Once it finally becomes clear that bombing every piece of asphalt in Britain isn't viable, the Germans steadily decrease their air operations on Britain, and Churchill announces the end of the threat to Britain's Air Force. And the idea of the Royal Navy being weakened enough to allow a German invasion is laughable. Britain will fight on. After this military disaster, Germany turns to Italy and demands that they don't be an idiot with Balkan. If they mean, hey Italy, make sure you don't lose, then we simply return to our timeline, as just a demand to do better is not enough to fix Italian military incompetence. If they instead mean, don't invade the Balkans, we have an Italy that is very annoyed at Germany, but does postpone their planned invasion of Greece. Of course, due to bad weather and German logistics not being ready, Operation Barbarossa is still delayed until conditions for Germany improve. Over in Africa, the British completely overrun Italian East Africa and eastern Libya, in the process capturing over 300,000 Italian soldiers. As the British pause to resupply and regroup, the Germans are very clear about their interest in the conflict. As the Vichy French regime begins to crumble in the region and America joins the war, Churchill grows more and more convinced that his southern strategy will be successful. Meanwhile, the Italians are starting to distance themselves from Germany, as feelers are put out for a separate peace deal. Germany, ignoring these developments, has struck into the Soviet Union, making sure to divert the panzer forces needed to overrun the city of Leningrad at great military cost to Germany. Elsewhere, the Germans don't reach quite as far as in our timeline, with Moscow remaining completely out of their reach. As the front lines stabilize, Germany creates puppet regimes in Belarus and Ukraine, trying to make use of their hatred towards the Bolsheviks with decent success. But across the war, the legitimacy of these regimes dwindle, as Germany poorly hides their long-term ambitions for the region, seizing the land for Lebensraum and removing the population there, or, at best, forcing them to become German. In 1942, Germany attempts to restart their momentum with a Zerg rush towards Stalingrad, hoping to cut off and capture Soviet oil. This conflict is hard fought, as the Soviets are still far stronger than the Germans expected. Then, the devastating news reaches Berlin in the middle of this operation. The Allies have invaded Sicily, and Italy has announced a ceasefire with the Allies. Panicked, Germany invades Italy, turning the state towards the Allies. With Germany trying to retake Italy, the Soviets break the German push around Stalingrad. Now, with America solidly in the war, the Allies entrenched in Italy, and the Soviets pushing back, German chances of winning have reached zero. Greece and Yugoslavia, already leaning towards the Allies, might join the war now, forcing Germany to turn attention there too. As Germany demands Bulgaria joins the Axis, they might even refuse, as even in our timeline, the Bulgarians were never enthusiastic about the Germans, remaining confident that the Soviets will win the war in the end. Bulgaria might even join up with the Allies too. So, Germany simply doesn't have the forces for a swift victory everywhere. And soon, yet another front is opened in France. Basically, we are just in a worse version of our own timeline for the Germans. Somewhere in 1945, the Germans would have to surrender. The broad lines of the peace deal look similar, but don't be fooled. Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Albania, at the very least, would now be in the Western sphere, with Albania potentially being smaller, while Italy could be a little bit bigger around Istria. While in Africa, Italy would definitely lose the East, they just might be allowed to keep Libya as a thank you for surrendering earlier. This is not a guarantee though. Beyond that, the Soviets could experience much greater issues in Belarus and Ukraine post-war, as the Germans had empowered any anti-Soviet group there. By the end of this scenario, we have a significantly weaker Soviet Union, but you may have noticed that these proposed tactics were not enough to achieve a German victory. So for now, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.